Hello, welcome to today's class. Today we will be covering the final section for the CBSE NET examination, where we will be covering the last set of 16 questions. So let's start with the very first question. Now all the questions that we will be covering today are very conceptual, so it's very important to have a in-depth understanding of all these topics. So the first question asks about the visual system of the brain. Now, before we start with solving this question, let's first understand the visual system that runs through the brain. So here is the image. So here are the eyeballs. You have the optic nerve running through. These nerves join at the optic chiasm, and then you have the various parts of the brain, that are helping in the system of visual retention. So lateral geniculate nucleus works for visual perception. Okay. Then you have hypothalamus that works to regulate the circadian rhythm. Okay. Then you have the pretectum that controls the reflexes of the pupil to the effect of the light that is coming up. And finally, the red section here is the superior colliculus that controls the orienting movement of the eyes. So since we can look at this diagram and understand the flow of the signals for the visual system here, the correct answer would be optic chiasm, lateral geniculate, and the superior colliculus. So 1, 2, and 4 would be the correct choices here. Okay, so we'll be covering this topic in detail in further classes, so stay tuned for the section on visual understanding. The next topic is CC's bioecological theory. Now, CC was a person who gave the concept of bioecological theory, and according to that, he posited that there are multiple cognitive potentials which underlie a single or a general intelligence concept in human beings. So this concept was unique to CC's, and the correct answer here would be A. Okay, and this notion was mainly aimed to enable critical thinking and knowledge resolving in human beings. Okay, the next question is a very direct question. You have to match the IQ score with the classification that has been named under the IQ listing. So the 50 to 70 is considered as a mild form of developmental delay. Okay, if it's 40 to 45, it's considered as 40 to 55 is considered as moderate form. Okay, then you have 20 to 40 IQ range as severe developmental delay, and below 25 is considered as a profound development delay. Profound development delay. Okay, so that's the correct match for the IQ scores. Okay, so this was a kind of very direct question based on rote learning. Now, according to ethological theory, species-specific behavior has following characteristics. Now, what is ethological theory? Ethological theory implies upbringing of an organism, be it human being, be it animals, in a natural behavior or considering its natural settings. So when we talk about the natural behavior, the most important element here is the behavior is innate or inborn in nature. So you have inborn or innate behavior. Okay, so when I'm saying the behavior is innate or inborn, that means I'm not learning it from someone, it's unlearned. A child, when is born, starts to cry. He's not learning that crying behavior from someone. It's a kind of innate behavior, and because it's innate, it's unlearned. So 3 is the correct option here. And finally, it's a fixed action pattern. For example, honeybees do a swingling dance. Okay, so that's a kind of fixed action pattern they do to recognize their source of food. Okay, so they have specific patterns of dancing for specific actions. Okay, so for recognizing a food, for recognizing their home, they have specific patterns, and that is what is known as fixed action pattern, and that fixed action pattern is specific to each species. So we can say it's a species specific behavior. So the correct answer here would be 1, 3, and 4. So A would be the correct choice here. Let's move on to the next question. Now, before we start with this question, let me make it very clear that we'll be covering the classes on operant conditioning and classical conditioning in detail, where we would be understanding the basics and the fundamentals of each of the conditioning theories. So now when we talk about operant conditioning, the operant conditioning model that was proposed by Skinner, it mainly tried to emphasize the overt and the observable behavior, okay, that someone can observe or that someone can visualize. We will try to understand that behavior, okay, and that behavior mostly deals with the functions rather than the structure of personality. So what kind of function I am doing and what kind of behavior I am doing, it would be affected by that rather than my basic personality structure, okay. And again, operant theory is a deterministic theory where there is no free will. So both A and R, both statements are correct, and I can say because of this, the reason is a correct explanation for the assertion, where I'm trying to explain the function of the behavior, and that function of the behavior governs the overt nature of a person, okay. And because it's governing the behavior, it's a deterministic theory. The next question. Now these are two scales. These scales are classically given to measure personality. Now since there are various parameters on which one can measure the personality, Ising gave a scale which was known as revised Ising personality questionnaire, and then there was a revised Neo personality inventory. So under both of these, there were various parameters that were included. So in one of these, he used three methods or three parameters. So Ising used three parameters. Those three parameters were extraversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. And under PIR, there were 5 factors, and these 5 factors were what we call as the ocean or the big 5 factors of the personality. So that was openness, conscientiousness, experience, then you have extraversion, you have agreeableness, and finally you have neuroticism. Now Ising, besides these 3 factors, gave the importance of lying. So he gave lying as an important factor, and there were 21 items in this concept. So I can say extraversion and neuroticism is common in both the scales. So you have extraversion and neuroticism here, you have extraversion and neuroticism here. And since both of them are common in both the scales, they have a positive correlation. So fourth is a correct statement. Then I say EPQR has a lie scale. That's again a correct response because it is 21 items and it has an extra factor on line. But the other scale does not have it. So this is again a correct option. Psychoticism here is negatively correlated to agreeableness and openness. Okay, so there is negative correlation between psychoticism and openness and agreeableness here, and the conscientiousness. So now we can understand that there are various studies which have shown that high scores of tough-minded people in psychoticism correlates with a tender score on agreeableness. So that shows clearly that there is a negative correlation among both the phenomena. And finally, the statement first, which says both the tests measure openness to experience, is incorrect because openness to experience is measured only in the Neo-PIR scale. Okay, so you have 2, 3, and 4 as the correct option. So the answer is D. The next question. This is a kind of very direct question. You have to match the theory and the author, the theorist. Okay, so you have the concept of functional autonomy that was given by Allport. So Allport basically proposed that there are motives for maturation. Then you have various other concepts that were given by other persons. So we'll need to match these concepts. So Forum gave the concept of human development, and he talked about interaction of needs. So that interaction of needs is called as dialectical humanism. So that concept is given by Fromm. So we call it a concept given by Erich. The next is you have the avoidance conflict. So you have various conflicts. We have the avoidance where we try to avoid 2 concepts. You have the avoidance approach, where you try to avoid one thing and you need to approach one thing. And finally, you have the approach conflict. So these concept was given by Dollard and Miller, where they gave a set of experiments to understand the three forms of conflict resolution. And finally, you have the concept of behaviorism or behavioristic theory that was given by Watson. Okay, so you have the correct set of answers here. So these are a kind of direct questions based on your knowledge. Now next, this is a very conceptual question, like which most of the GRE papers have. So you need to be very clear on understanding the concept first before solving this question. So the question asks here, Mr. A goes out on a frosty morning and finds his car covered with a thick layer of frost. What he needs to do is he needs to work that ice off with a ice scraper. He returns back to the home, but he cannot find anything. He cannot find a ice scraper. But since he need to resolve this issue, he sees a hard plastic spatula in the kitchen, and he uses that spatula as an ice scraper. So what he is trying to do is, he is trying to overcome his functional fixedness. Now, what is the concept of functional fixedness? Functional fixedness basically means you have a prior mindset where you try to understand that there is a certain problem, and this problem can be resolved only by a certain means. Okay, you are not trying to you don't try to look beyond that. Okay, so your mind is set with a fixed set of solutions for that problem, and when you try to overcome those solutions, we call it overcoming the problem of functional fixedness. Okay, so the correct answer here is D, that is functional fixedness. Okay, so let's now move on to the next set of questions. The next and the final set of questions will include a paragraph question. That's a kind of very conceptual question that has been asked this time. So now a lot of assertion reason questions here. Now, this question asks about what is radiant energy. So when we talk about the concept of radiant energy, the first statement says radiant energy is propagated in a continuous wave form and therefore can be described as a wavelength. Okay, so that statement is talking about the structure of the wave. And finally, the next statement says radiant energy behaves as if it is emitted as a discrete quanta of energy, or we can say a photon of energy. Okay, so since both these statements are correct, one statement talks about the waves and other statement talks about the particles. So they talk about the duality of the wave motion theory. So both the statements are correct, but they are independently true and they are not the correct explanations for one another. Okay, the next question is a kind of very direct question which has been asked, but it's a controversial question. This question, this statement has been propounded by Mayers. The question says it's given by Barron, so it's a kind of controversial question there. So Mayers basically propounded that the sexual motivation is a result of interplay of physiology, environment, and imagination. So that concept was propounded by Mayer. And the correct answer here should be physiology and imagination. So it's doubtful why it is written as Byron here. The next question is on the Lazarus cognitive appraisal theory. So we'll be covering this theory in depth when we'll be covering the details on the various topics of psychology. Okay, so what does Lazarus basically talked about? So Lazarus talked about that when there is an event, you try to think about that event. Okay, and then there is a simultaneous emotional response and a cognitive response. Okay, so this response is a simultaneous in nature. So what is explained here is, here it says that situation precedes the emotion. That is incorrect because both of them are simultaneous in nature. So I can say assertion is incorrect, but reason says emotion influence thinking and vice versa. Thinking influence emotions and emotions influence thinking. Both the statements are correct. So reason is correct here. So the correct answer would be A is false and reason is true. Okay. Now this question is based on passage, but the important thing to note here is that this passage just shows you an introduction, and you cannot answer any of the question if you just read the passage. You need to have a prior knowledge about the subject. Okay, so it's not like a simple reading comprehension passage. This passage will just give you an idea or a direction in which direction you have to direct your thoughts, but will not give you an exact answer for the problems here. Okay, now this whole paragraph is basically based on understanding and solving a research problem. So when you have a research problem, you try to identify the problem and you try to propose a hypothesis. Now, hypothesis is a tentative solution to a problem. You try to tentatively give a solution to a problem and then try to see whether the solution that you have propounded is correct or incorrect. Okay, so there can be various types of hypothesis. It can be directional, it can be non-directional, correlational, causal. Edward was a person who tried to give three kinds of variables. So he gives stimulus variable, organismic variable, and behavioral variable. Then he also classified the variables as continuous and discrete in nature. And the discrete variables were later given as real discrete or artificially discrete variables. Okay. And Robinson gave a classification of psychological studies where he classified laboratory experiments, field experiments, ex post facto field, and ex post facto experimental methods of study. So here what is given is just the names of the variables and just the names of the types of psychological studies that are conducted. So you need to have a prior knowledge about these before solving such kind of questions. Now, what is the difference between a directional and a non-directional hypothesis? Directional hypothesis is one where I tend to provide the direction, whether the relation of one parameter to another is increasing in nature or decreasing in nature. Okay, while in non-directional, I just say that there are two parameters A and B, both of them are related, but I cannot say whether they are positively related or negatively related. Okay, so since this question asks you about non-directional hypothesis, I say male and females differ on anxiety. That's correct because I'm taking gender on one side and anxiety on one side, and I'm saying there is some relation. I don't know whether it's a positive or negative. So it's a non-directional hypothesis. I'm saying intelligence is negatively related to academic achievement. So that means it's directional in nature. I'm saying there is a negative relationship. Anxiety disrupts academic performance. So I'm again saying anxiety has a negative correlation with performance. So it's again a directional hypothesis. Stress and work output are related. I don't know the real way in which they are related, whether it's positive or negative. So it's a non-directional hypothesis. So 1 and 4 are the only choices which are non-directional hypothesis. The next question here is, you have to pick up a choice which is artificially discrete organismic variable. Now let's first understand an organismic variable. Organismic variable is one that gives you or explains about the characteristic of an organism. That means the height, the weight, the gender, the age. Okay, so these are all I should say kind of organismic variable. Now we need to pick up a variable which is discrete in nature. Okay, so the variable which is discrete in nature is say gender, for example, is naturally discrete. There can be male or female. Okay, age, I can say it's a kind of discrete variable to some extent, but intelligence is usually a continuous variable. In this case, I am trying to make it as discrete because I am trying to classify it into three ways, that is low, average, and high. So what I am doing is I am classifying intelligence into three parameters. Okay, and therefore I am saying it's a artificially discrete. Originally it should be a continuous variable, but here I am artificially making it a discrete variable. So the correct answer here would be C. The next question is, which of the following cannot be employed as a dependent variable? Now, before we understand this, let's first understand what is dependent variable and independent variable. Dependent variable is one which can be manipulated. So you can manipulate the dependent variable by independent variable, and independent variable is one which cannot be manipulated. Okay, so here I can say age is a parameter that cannot be manipulated. If someone is 40 years, he's 40 years, someone is 20 years, he's 20 years. I cannot manipulate the age of the person, but I can definitely manipulate these. For example, heart rate in relation to the stress level. So heart rate is manipulated with stress. Okay, so heart rate is dependent on stress here. If I am saying relation of heart rate to age, I can say the changes in the heart rate pattern with age. So that's again, heart rate is dependent on age. So heart rate is a dependent variable here. Learning rate can be governed on the amount of study, okay, or the time of study. So it's again dependent on those parameters. Reaction time on drug level, the kind of drug intake that you have taken. So it's again dependent on some other parameters. So these three are the dependent variables, and age is the only parameter which is independent. So the correct choice here would be 1, that is 4 only. Now next question. Here what you are trying to do is you are asked to find out the ascending order in terms of researcher's ability to control the secondary variance. Now when I am in a laboratory settings, I can greatly control the variance. Okay. When I am in a field setting, I can partially control the settings. And when I am in a situation which has already happened, so exposed factor is a situation that has already happened, I can least control the secondary variables because what is to happen has already happened. Okay, so I can least control the factors here, and I can maximum control the factors in a laboratory setting, because under laboratory experiment I am taking an experiment, so I can control all the variables that I wish to control. Okay, so the correct ascending order should be 3, 2, 1. Now this should be the correct answer here, but none of the choice have a correct option of 3, 2, 1. So let's see what would be the final answer that would be declared by the CBSE net examination committee. Most probably this question should be given a bonus marks, because this is the correct answer and there is none of the choices that matches the correct option here. Okay, and finally, we have already understood the various kinds of study. I've talked about the exposed factor study here. So exposed factor study is a study where the thing has already happened, and after that you are trying to go into the settings and understand what has happened. So let's understand the question. After the earthquake, the researcher interviews a group of subjects to understand whether the earthquake has changed the attitude towards faith. So the earthquake has already come in the region, okay, and everything is, the devastation has already occurred. Now what the researcher is doing is he is going after the earthquake and trying to understand the attitude of the people towards their faith. So that's a kind of exposed factor study, because it's happening after the thing has already happened, or after the devastation has already occurred. You are trying to go there and do some kind of research. So that's the exposed factor research. So the correct answer here would be A. Okay, so with this we cover the first 50, the set of 50 questions for the paper 2 for psychology CBSE net examination December 2014. Since we can see the last section here that we discussed today was lot of questions were conceptual in nature. We need to be very clear on the concepts and need to do an extensive study to understand the various questions and the paper pattern. We'll be covering paper 3 in a separate class. Till then, have a good day ahead.